Okay, so as I mentioned before, there are 3 different experimental designs. When you have an experiment and you have 2 separate groups completely, we're going to call that the independent group design. So you randomly allocate the participants into 2 different groups. If you have a matched design, so the second one is matched, you pair them and then you randomly allocate them. They're going to be paired based on some type of characteristic that is relevant to the experiment. Maybe they're paired based on age, gender, ethnicity, whatever it is. They're going to be paired, and IQ is one that's often used, and then they're going to be placed. So maybe they'll do an IQ test. They'll get the top 2 IQs, one person in one group, one in the other, the next 2, and then they divide them up and they match their groups. Then also the last design is the repeated one, where we actually use the same participants in both conditions. So they're going to be part of the experimental group and the control group. Not every experiment has to have 2 groups. There are some experiments that only have an experimental group. So don't be fooled in that case. There are some experiments that won't have a control group. Generally, if there's just the one group, okay, and they're only doing one condition, it would be an independent design. So an independent design can just have one group. But obviously, if it's one group that does 2 conditions, then it's repeated. I'm just pointing out that sometimes they won't have a control group, they only have an experimental group. When you have an independent group and you have 2 random groups, obviously we have not controlled for the participants. If everyone walked in the door today and I randomly allocated you based on a number that you picked up, maybe you picked up a deck of cards, and I said, okay, everyone sit on this side, on that side, could I have randomly had all the males sit on one side and all the females sit on the other side by random chance? I could have. And then what if my experiment, could that affect my experiment? Basically, if you're doing an independent design, you're not controlling participants in any way. So their characteristics related to the participant are going to probably affect the experiments. It's really important to know that participant-related extraneous variables are going to be prominent in most. The reason why you would choose to do a repeated study where you have the same participants in the control and the experimental group is because you're going to eliminate that whole participant extraneous variable because you're using the same participants. It is important with the exam that you know why one design might be used over another one and be able to justify and talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So here it says, an advantage of the repeated design is that it controls participant related extraneous variables because the same participants are used. However, what else? It also requires fewer participants as a second point here. Obviously, you've just got one group doing both conditions. We only need to have half the number of participants, which can be quite useful and make it more cost effective. So that's another advantage of, so here we're talking about repeated design. However, if I got you to do the same experiment twice, I'm pretty sure you're going to get bored the second time. It's going to be like, oh, not again. Also, practice on performance. If you've done something already, are you not going to do better the second time because you've already done it before? So one of the biggest limitations that you will need to be able to discuss is the order effect, the order in which you do the experiment. So the order effect talks about boredom, talks about practice on performance. So those 2 things affect the order. So it's useful to be able to identify, well, the order effect is something that may limit this design, but hopefully you already know something to overcome the order effect is called counterbalancing. Okay, so what that would mean is, so you were all my experimental group today, imagine, and what I might do is I would have this half of the room do the control condition first, or whatever my experiment was, and then this half do the experimental condition, and then I would swap you. But you would both do both conditions, I would just change the order. which is what counterbalancing is about.